comfort. In our Bible study, we gave a little attention to the kind of ways that we seek comfort when we have things happen in our life. I'm going to read for you this morning something that we probably, maybe even ought to try to say together, but I'm going to read it for you, and that's the 23rd Psalm. The Lord promises to each of us, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. To remind each of us, we're looking at the Beatitudes during our journey during Lent, and I'm reading now from the 4th verse of the 5th chapter of Matthew. Just one verse. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. When we look at the Beatitudes, we experience probably normal and sensible kind of emotions, but in an entirely new and different way. Why should Jesus ask us, how blessed are you if you are sorrowful? Doesn't seem to make sense. We wonder, should he have said, how happy are you when sorrow consumes your life? We can certainly understand how he could say, how grand things are when you are filled with joy. We would agree with that opinion. How marvelous it is to offer this proclamation. How excellent it is when, folks, you feel satisfied and comfortable. But what Jesus said wasn't exactly that, was it? In the first few Beatitudes, Jesus presents emotions and feelings and basic aspects about life that seem to be contrary to the way we think and the way we talk. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Jesus' conversation now about sorrow reveals that there are many different kinds of levels to these emotions. Some are distant, some are far off, others are a little closer and held deep down inside, intensely very personal. The first of these phases of sorrow is the grief that comes about just what we call the human condition. It was the great evangelist Paul who said, I am the least worthy. In his confession, it may seem to ring true, for at a quick glance, we remember from youngsters growing up that Paul was the guy that was persecuting Jesus. Later, he was struck and he was blind. A group was taking care of him, and literally there were like scales that fell from his eyes, and he regained his sight again. Prophets, the speakers especially from the Old Testament of ancient times, talk to each of us about the mourning and the concept of mourning. Somehow in the midst of sorrow and despair, Moses, you remember Moses and his people, the people of Israel, they found a measure of consolation as well as hope. But Moses went back up the mountain and gave God his words of law again. Again, Moses went up for the second time and was given the law again. The second time he was accepted in what he was saying. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. It's important to shift our observation and our awareness from just ourselves. When Jesus sat down and those gathered around him, he indicated sorrow doesn't only come at a bad time. Sorrow comes in many wonderful times of our life. Well, we don't like to hear that. I don't know of anything more difficult for a pastor than burying a child of parents. And the younger the child, the more difficult. Parents often would say to me, Pastor, this isn't fair. I would have rather had God taken me than my son or my daughter. When this happens, two things can happen. One is folks find a firm faith to deal with that. On the other hand, they move away. They may move away from God. Some have asked, how could this be? How could a loving God take my son or my daughter? Some of you remember Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, a great book on death and dying. On death and dying. She points out in it the stages of working through death of a spouse or a family member, a friend, or a child. And one of those stages is to be angry. Anger begins to turn one away from God and toward other comforts. The full range of painful emotions is held in. They fester, as we say. And yet, ironically, it seems that on the surface to others, everything is just fine. Everything is just fine. I told our Bible study group for the last 50 years plus, one of the things that I've tried to do is to minister to people when they have lost a loved one. They're not connected maybe with a church or with a pastor, or they're inactive. I try to do my very best to bring to them the concept that God still loves them. In fact, I'm looking out over this morning. There are 2 or 3 of you here this morning in the last, shall we say, several months that have shared somebody that you love and asked me to help them at the time of death in the family. In each setting, we often have to go back to some very basic things. I watch persons sometimes grow, and some of you have been so good in supporting people who are struggling in the loss of someone in their family. Folks, that's the things that they'll remember. If you have friends or neighbors and they've lost someone in your family and you support them, I want to say to you, that's the time that God not only comes alive in you, but God also shares with them. There are moments, yes, when people withdraw, when we don't let others in, when we're afraid to show our emotions. We distance ourselves often from what really happened. How blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. It encourages us then, as many of you have done, and several of you have done just lately, to be God's agents in the community in which you share, whether it's a friendship or a family. The plain fact is that feelings that we have are all very real, and we have to deal with them, and we need to support people. And if you can be an agent for God, how blessed indeed are you. We need to be able to see inside the skin of another person. For so many people say, I'm just fine, Joel. I'm just fine. You don't need to worry about me at all. And we know that grief is very difficult, or sorrow or pain. We need to be careful not to distance ourselves from these folks. So where do we go? We can help them turn to God. It's an experience that we all need to share in. I often think of a little boy or a little girl. They're outside and they fall and they skin their knees and they come running in and they say, Mommy, I got a cut on my knee. Will you help me? And Mommy will wash it off, or Dad will wash it off. And put a bandage over it. And kiss the knee or kiss the hand. And all of a sudden, they feel better. Now, it's a simple picture. But it's a picture of what we can do with our faith. In God's arm, we will find comfort, peace. And those arms may have had pain before. Edgar Jackson wrote a book entitled You and Your Grief. It's a good book. I advise you to find it in the library. It's there. I've used it. It's a book that talks about the bridges that we can be as Christians to help other people. Again, the book is You and Your Grief. Where do you go? Where do you turn? There was a rabbi that wrote a book. Some of you have read it. When bad things happen to good people. Have some of you read that? When bad things happen to good people. Some of you then probably have read it. Saw a couple hands go up. He talks about the death of his son, who suffered a particular horrible disease that causes children to age very, very early, prematurely. When his boy was 5 or 6 years old, he looked like he was 70. When the child was 5 or 6 years old, he looked like he was 70. So when he turned to 13, they lost his life. He said, I had been a good person. I tried to do what was right in the sight of God. More than that, I've been living the religiously committed life. I believe that I was following God's way and doing God's work. He said, how could this happen to my family? All of those answerless why questions cropped up for him. As he worked through it, he said in the book, he discovered that God was very real to him, that God was part of his life. There is a God, he said. Furthermore, he said, I'm able to assert that God comes and gives us strength in these moments. God urges us to believe, to create the circumstance of good and growing faith. For God, the important aspect of life is that we live and deal with life's twists and turns. We grow through the journey that is measured by how we turn to God, how we find direction, how we find purpose in the midst of what is heavy sorrow. We can turn away from God. We can isolate ourselves. We can destroy ourselves. We can eat ourselves up with grief and sorrow and pain in our own isolated sphere. Or, as my teenagers like to hear, in conclusion, or we can turn to God, who is a loving God, whose Son died for us, whose Son lives again. Edgar Jackson writes these words about the Beatitude. Blessed are those of you who use their sorrow creatively as they find a security that is not shaken by a circumstance, but rather produces the fruits of enriched sympathy, heightened understanding, and deepest faith. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And let me close with a line or two of personal. There's a couple couples here that have really been helpful to other families. You're here this morning. I had this sermon already printed up, written up before you came, but I'm glad you're here this morning because you are a great help to those families. Amen. Well, let's see.